The secret vertical growth trick to triple your home nursery revenue, the industry secret reveal. Most home nursery owners are leaving thousands of dollars on the table by growing the wrong way. By implementing this specific vertical growth trick, we've unlocked a method to triple production capacity while focusing on elite, high-margin herbs. It is time to stop growing wide and start growing up to turn your nursery into a high-revenue operation. The secret vertical growth trick to triple your home nursery revenue. Cold open picture your greenhouse right now. Walk through it in your mind. Rows of trays laid out flat, spaced just far enough apart that you can shuffle between them with a watering can. Now look up. Look at everything above waist height. Look at everything above your head. That space, all of it, is empty. It's not soil, it's not product, it's not revenue. It's just air you're paying rent, heat, and electricity to condition. Most home nursery owners never think about that space because nobody ever taught them to. We're taught to think in square feet. Real estate agents talk in square feet. Zoning boards talk in square feet. So naturally, when we plan a growing operation, we think in square feet too. We ask, how much floor can I cover with trays, instead of asking, how much cubic volume can I turn into product? That single shift in thinking, from square feet to cubic feet, is the difference between a hobby that occasionally pays for itself and a home-based business that can compete with commercial operations 10 times its footprint. This script lays out exactly how that shift works, why it works, and how you put it to work in your own space starting this season. Part 1. The Revenue Reality Check. Let's start with the uncomfortable math nobody wants to run. Take a typical home nursery operating out of a backyard greenhouse or a converted garage, somewhere in the range of 200 to 400 square feet of usable growing floor. Laid out flat, with standard 10-20 trays or small pots spaced for hand watering and light access, that floor might hold somewhere between 150 and 300 trays, depending on spacing and walkway allowance. At an average wholesale return per tray of common bedding plants or starter herbs, that translates into a modest, seasonally limited income. It's enough to justify the hobby. It is rarely enough to justify calling it a business. Now compare that to what land actually costs in 2026. Urban and suburban land prices have not been kind to small growers. Even in secondary markets, the cost per square foot of usable outdoor or covered growing space has climbed steadily for years, driven by competition from residential development, commercial real estate, and the general scarcity of flat, zoned, water-accessible land near population centers. If you're a home nursery operator, you are almost certainly not in a position to simply buy more land to scale your flatbed layout. Even if you wanted to expand your footprint by, say, 50%, you'd be looking at real acquisition or lease costs that erase most of the marginal revenue that extra floor space would generate. This is the trap traditional flatbed thinking puts nursery owners in. Your revenue is capped by your floor area. Your floor area is capped by your land. Your land is capped by your budget. And your budget in 2026 buys you less square footage than it did 5 years ago. Follow that chain to its logical end, and you get exactly what most home nurseries experience: a hard ceiling on income that no amount of hustle, better marketing, or longer hours can break through. You can only water, prune, and harvest so many flat trays in a day, and you can only fit so many flat trays into a fixed footprint. Here's the part that should genuinely bother you. While your floor space has been fixed, the volume above that floor space has been sitting there completely unused. A typical hobby greenhouse or converted structure has alleys heights of 8, 10, sometimes 12 feet or more. If you're only using the bottom 18 to 24 inches of that vertical space, which is roughly what a flat bench or ground-level tray occupies, you are leaving the vast majority of your cubic volume completely idle. Think about what that means in financial terms. If your greenhouse is 300 square feet with a 10-foot ceiling, You technically have 3,000 cubic feet of climate-controlled, light-accessible growing volume. A flatbed layout might productively use somewhere around 600 to 900 cubic feet of that. The layer near the ground where your trays sit and where light penetration is easiest to manage with simple overhead fixtures. That leaves 2,000 plus cubic feet, easily 2/3 of your total volume, doing absolutely nothing for your bottom line. You are paying to heat it, paying to humidify it, paying property tax and insurance on the structure that contains it, and getting zero return from it. That is the invisible cost most nursery owners never calculate. It's not a cost that shows up as a line item on a bill. It's an opportunity cost, and it's the single biggest reason flatbed nurseries plateau. You're not failing because you're a bad grower. You're failing because you built a revenue model around the 20% of your space that's easiest to see and ignored the 80% that isn't. This is where vertical density comes in, and this is the concept we need to unpack properly before we talk about implementation. Part 2. Understanding vertical density. Vertical density is a simple idea with big implications. Instead of asking, how much floor can I cover, you ask, how much of my cubic volume can I convert into productive growing surface? The floor is just your starting layer. Every foot of height above it is another potential layer, provided you can deliver light, air circulation, and access to each one. Here's why this matters so much for a home-based operation specifically. Commercial greenhouse operations can scale by acquiring more land. They have the capital, the financing, and often the zoning relationships to do it. A home nursery owner typically doesn't have that option. Your land is what it is. Your structure is what it is. If you want to scale revenue without scaling your footprint, the only lever left to pull is height. Vertical density is not one option among many for a home-based grower looking to scale. For most home operations, it is the only viable option. You cannot buy more land in most residential situations. You can, however, build up. Let's put real numbers behind this, because vague talk about growing up doesn't pay bills. Specific density multipliers do. Say your existing flat layout gives you one productive layer at roughly 18 inches of vertical clearance per tray, allowing headroom for the plant plus your hand and watering can. In a 10-foot greenhouse, after accounting for aisle clearance, structural elements, and a reasonable margin at the very top and bottom for mechanical systems, you can realistically fit somewhere between 4 and 6 horizontal growing layers using a tiered rack or shelving system, depending on what you're growing and how tall your target crop gets at harvest. 4 layers instead of 1 is not a 4x increase in revenue on paper. Usable production per layer typically drops somewhat as you go up, because top layers get better light but sometimes tighter access, and middle layers can suffer from shading if you're not careful with your lighting design. But even being conservative and assuming each additional layer only captures 70 to 80% of the productivity of your ground layer, once you factor in access and light distribution challenges, you are still looking at something in the neighborhood of doubling to tripling your total production capacity within the exact same footprint you already have, already pay rent or mortgage on, and already climate control. That's the entire premise of this method. You are not trying to grow more plants by expanding outward. You're trying to grow more plants by expanding upward, inside a box you already own. Part 3. Why elite herbs are the right crop for this system. Vertical density solves the volume problem. But volume alone doesn't triple revenue, it just triples the number of units you can produce. If those units are low-margin commodity bedding plants, tripling your output might only modestly move your income, because you're still fighting on price with big-box retailers who can undercut you on commodity product every time. This is why pairing vertical density with a shift toward high-margin, lower-volume specialty herbs is where the real revenue multiplication happens. Elite culinary and specialty herbs, think specialty basils, unusual mints, edible flowers grown as companion herbs, and other chef and restaurant-facing varieties that don't show up on a typical garden center shelf, carry wholesale and direct-to-consumer prices that can be several multiples higher per unit than standard bedding plants. They're also frequently sold by weight, by bunch, or by specialty subscription rather than by flat, which changes your entire pricing structure. There's a practical reason elite herbs work especially well in a vertical system, beyond just the margin story. Many high-value culinary herbs are naturally compact, shallow-rooted, and tolerant of the kind of controlled, uniform environment a tiered vertical rack provides. You're not trying to squeeze a sprawling squash vine into an 18-inch shelf gap. You're growing something that was practically designed by nature to thrive in a small footprint with consistent light and airflow. That means your vertical layers aren't a compromise for these crops. They're often a better environment than an open, flat bed would be, because you can dial in light intensity and airflow per layer far more precisely than you can across an open bench exposed to whatever ambient conditions your greenhouse has that day. Put those two pieces together, more usable growing layers, and a crop category where each unit of output is worth more, and you can see where tripling revenue actually comes from. It's rarely a single miracle number. It's a multiplier on volume from vertical density, combined with a multiplier on price per unit from shifting your product mix towards specialty herbs, and those two multipliers compound rather than simply add. Part 4. The core trick. Designing your vertical system now. Let's get into the actual mechanics, because the concept only matters if you can build it. Step 1. Audit your existing cubic volume before buying a single shelf or rack. Walk your space and measure it properly, not just floor length and width, but ceiling height at every point, since many home structures have sloped roofs, support beams, or hanging equipment that reduce usable height in certain zones. Map out where your tallest clearances are and where your obstructions are. This becomes your blueprint for where tiered systems can go the highest and where you'll need shorter units or none at all. Pay close attention to your existing light sources during this audit. Natural light entering through a greenhouse roof or side glazing behaves very differently depending on how tall a rack system you put beneath it. A rack that's too tall near a low light source will just shade its own lower shelves. This is the single most common design mistake first-time vertical growers make. They build height without accounting for how light falls through that height and end up with gorgeous top shelves and starved, leggy bottom shelves. Say Step 2. Choose your vertical format. There are a few structural approaches, and the right one depends on your budget, your structure, and your crop choice. Tiered wire or wood shelving racks are the simplest and cheapest entry point. You're essentially stacking multiple flatbed layers on top of each other, using standard greenhouse shelving units, each shelf getting its own supplemental grow light strip. This is the most accessible starting point for a home nursery because it uses equipment that's widely available and doesn't require specialized plumbing or electrical work beyond running a few extra light circuits. A-frame or ladder-style benches angle your growing surfaces so that each tier gets more direct light exposure without one shelf shading the one below it as severely as a flat stack would. These work particularly well against a south-facing wall or under a sloped greenhouse roof, since the angle can be designed to match your existing light angle. Vertical tower or column systems, often hydroponic or semi-hydroponic, stack plants around a central column with nutrient delivery running top to bottom and light coming either from ambient sources around the tower or from vertical LED strips running alongside it. These have a higher upfront cost and require more technical setup, but they achieve the highest true cubic density of any of these three approaches, because you're not just stacking flat layers, you're using the full cylindrical volume around a central spine. Most home nurseries getting started with vertical density should begin with tiered shelving, because it lets you prove the concept, learn your light and airflow patterns, and generate revenue before committing capital to a more specialized tower system. You can always add tower systems later as a second phase once you understand your space's specific light behavior. Step 3. Solve light before you solve anything else. This is the part that separates a vertical system that actually triples output from one that just triples your electric bill while producing weak, leggy plants nobody wants to buy. Every additional layer you add competes with the layers around it for light, unless you give it its own dedicated source. This means your lighting budget scales roughly with your shelf count. If you're adding a fourth tier, you need a fourth tier's worth of supplemental lighting, not a slightly brighter version of the lighting you had for one tier. Skimping here is the most common way ambitious vertical projects fail. Growers get excited about the volume math, underinvest in lighting per layer, and end up with beautiful top shelves and unsellable bottom shelves. Budget for full-spectrum LED strip lighting mounted at the underside of each shelf level, positioned to illuminate the shelf directly below it. Match your light intensity and duration to whatever specialty herb you've chosen. Many culinary herbs have well-documented light requirements, and matching those requirements per shelf, rather than applying one blanket lighting setup across your whole structure, is what keeps every layer performing at a sellable standard rather than just your top layer. See Step 4. Solve airflow. Second, stacked layers trap humidity and stagnant air far more easily than an open flat bed does, and that trapped, still air is exactly the condition that invites fungal issues, mildew, and pest pressure, all of which will hit you disproportionately hard on high-margin specialty herb crops, because a single outbreak can wipe out your most valuable inventory in days. Install small circulation fans at each tier or run a vertical airflow column through your tower system so that air is actively moving across every layer, not just recycling near the ceiling where your top shelf sits. This is a modest additional cost compared to your racking and lighting investment, but it is not optional if you want your vertical system to actually be more productive than your old flat bed rather than just more crowded. See Step 5. Design for access, not just density. It is entirely possible to build a vertical system so dense that you physically cannot reach the plants to water, prune, or harvest them without significant time loss or plant damage. This defeats the entire purpose. Your goal is maximum productive density that you can still service efficiently, not maximum density in the abstract. Leave yourself a genuine working aisle, enough to comfortably reach every shelf with a watering wand, shears, and a harvest tray without having to contort yourself or risk knocking over the tier above the one you're working on. Consider adding wheeled or sliding access for taller tower systems, so you don't need a stepladder every time you need to reach the top tier. The time you save on efficient daily servicing compounds over an entire growing season into real labor savings, which flows straight to your margin. Part 5. Putting the numbers together. Let's walk through a composite example to make the whole model concrete, without pretending any single operation's numbers are universal. Your actual results depend heavily on your specific crops, your local specialty herb market, and how well you execute the lighting and airflow design above. Start with a baseline flatbed operation producing a modest specialty herb crop on standard bedding plant-style flat trays across roughly 300 square feet of floor. Convert that same 300 square feet into a 4-tier vertical shelving system, properly lit and ventilated per tier as described above. You now have, in effect, 4 productive layers instead of 1. Even conservatively discounting each additional layer's output relative to the ground floor to account for slightly reduced access and any residual light variance between tiers, you're looking at total production capacity, in the range of 2.5 to 3.5 times your original flatbed output, all inside the same 300 square feet, the same land cost, the same lease or mortgage payment, and largely the same base structure. Now layer the crop mix shift on top of that volume increase. If you were previously producing a general bedding plant mix and you shift your production towards specialty culinary herbs that carry meaningfully higher per unit wholesale or direct-to-chef pricing, your revenue per unit produced increases independently of your volume increase. Multiply a 2.5 to 3.5 times volume increase by even a modest increase in average price per unit from the crop shift, and the combined effect on total revenue lands convincingly in triple your revenue territory for many home operations, without buying a single additional square foot of land. The important caveat, and the one that separates operators who actually hit these numbers from those who don't, this math assumes you execute the lighting, airflow, and access design properly. A poorly lit, poorly ventilated vertical system will underperform even a well-run flat bed because you'll lose plants to leggy growth, mold, and pest pressure faster than you can sell them. The trick isn't just stacking shelves, it's stacking shelves correctly. Part 6. Choosing which elite herbs to grow. Not every herb is a good candidate for this system, and not every high-margin herb is equally easy to sell. When selecting your crop mix for a vertical density operation, weigh these factors together